The legs go first. That is not a dramatic statement designed to frighten you. It is one of the most consistently documented patterns in the physiology of aging, confirmed across decades of longitudinal research on how the human body declines when it is not actively supported. Not the heart first, not the lungs first, not the brain, not the eyes, not the joints. The legs, specifically the skeletal muscle tissue of the lower body, which begins losing mass, losing fiber density, losing the neuromuscular coordination that makes movement feel effortless at a rate that accelerates through the 50s and reaches a genuinely alarming pace in the 60s and 70s in people who are not specifically countering the process. And what most people do not understand, what the standard conversation about aging almost never addresses directly, is that the loss of leg strength is not just a mobility issue. It is a metabolic issue, a hormonal issue, a neurological issue, a cardiovascular issue. The legs are the engine of the body, in a way that goes far beyond their obvious function of carrying you from one place to another. And when that engine weakens, the consequences ripple outward into every system that depends on it. Here is the part that changes everything. The loss of leg muscle that most people experience is not inevitable at the rate or the timeline most people experience it. The human body at 60, at 65, at 70 retains an extraordinary capacity to respond to the right nutritional inputs with measurable preservation and in many cases meaningful rebuilding of the very muscle tissue that declining legs are losing. This is not speculation. This is established exercise physiology and nutritional science. The mechanism is real, the response is real, and the specific foods that activate it most powerfully in aging muscle are specific enough to name 5 of them. And what they do inside the muscle cells of the legs, at the molecular level, is the part of this story that you have never been told with enough precision to actually act on it. If this is the kind of direct, mechanism-driven health conversation you have been searching for, hit like and subscribe right now. Dr. Victor Lang built this channel to bridge the gap between what the research actually shows and what most people actually know, and this video is that bridge for one of the most important topics in the biology of aging. Let us start with why the legs weaken specifically and preferentially, because understanding the mechanism of the problem is what makes the solution legible. Skeletal muscle throughout the body is not a static tissue. It is in a constant state of turnover, breaking down and rebuilding in a dynamic equilibrium that is governed by the balance between 2 biological processes called muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. When you are young and hormonally optimal, these 2 processes are roughly balanced with a slight tip towards synthesis. Muscle is built, maintained, and repaired efficiently. But after roughly 40, and accelerating significantly after 55, several simultaneous changes shift this equilibrium toward breakdown. Testosterone and growth hormone, both anabolic signals that favor muscle protein synthesis, decline. The sensitivity of muscle cells to insulin, which is also required for efficient protein synthesis, decreases. Chronic low-grade inflammation, which drives muscle protein breakdown, increases. And critically, the anabolic response of muscle tissue to protein intake becomes blunted. A younger muscle receiving 30 grams of protein builds significantly more new tissue than an older muscle receiving the same amount, because the molecular machinery translating that protein intake into structural muscle has become less efficient with age. Here is the detail that most people miss, and that is central to why the legs are disproportionately affected. The largest, most metabolically active muscle groups in the human body are in the legs. The quadriceps, the hamstrings, the gluteal muscles, the gastrocnemius and soleus of the calves, together represent the majority of the body's total skeletal muscle mass. When muscle protein synthesis becomes less efficient with age, the loss is greatest where the most muscle exists and where the metabolic demand for maintenance is highest. The legs. And because these muscle groups are also the primary consumers of blood glucose through insulin-stimulated uptake, their loss creates a secondary metabolic disaster. Less leg muscle means less glucose disposal. Less glucose disposal means higher blood sugar, higher insulin demand, greater insulin resistance. The physical and metabolic consequences of leg muscle loss feed each other in a downward cycle that compounds over years. This is why what you eat, specifically what you eat in the targeted service of preserving and rebuilding leg muscle, is not a peripheral concern in the conversation about healthy aging. It is central to the entire architecture of metabolic, cardiovascular, and physical health after 50, and the 5 foods that follow are not randomly assembled. Each one addresses a specific biological bottleneck in the process of muscle protein synthesis and muscle preservation in aging tissue. Together, they constitute a nutritional framework that the research supports with a depth and consistency that places them in a different category from general healthy eating advice. The first food is eggs, and specifically the whole egg, including the yolk, which has been unfairly vilified for decades and which contains the most bioavailable, complete, rapidly absorbed amino acid profile of any whole food available. The leucine content of eggs deserves particular attention because leucine is not just any amino acid. It is the primary molecular trigger for a signaling pathway called mTORC1, which is the master switch for muscle protein synthesis in skeletal muscle. When leucine concentrations in the blood rise above a certain threshold after a meal, mTORC1 activates and the cellular machinery for building new muscle proteins turns on. In aging muscle, the leucine threshold required to trigger this response is actually higher than in young muscle, meaning older adults need more leucine per meal to achieve the same anabolic stimulus. 2 whole eggs provide approximately 1 gram of leucine, making them one of the most efficient leucine delivery vehicles available in food form, alongside a full spectrum of the other essential amino acids that muscle protein synthesis requires as building blocks. Research comparing muscle protein synthesis rates in older adults after egg consumption versus other protein sources shows eggs consistently producing superior anabolic responses per gram of protein consumed, a finding attributed to the complete amino acid profile, the rapid digestibility, and the leucine concentration working in combination. The second food is wild salmon, and the reason it belongs on this list goes beyond its protein content, which is substantial and complete in its amino acid profile. Wild salmon is one of the richest dietary sources of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, and the role of these fatty acids in aging muscle is more directly relevant than most people realize. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition demonstrated that omega-3 supplementation in older adults significantly increased the anabolic response of leg muscle to protein intake, effectively reducing the anabolic resistance that makes muscle building less efficient in aging tissue. The mechanism involves the omega-3 fatty acids being incorporated into muscle cell membranes, where they influence the fluidity and signaling properties of the membrane in ways that improve the cellular response to both insulin and leucine. In practical terms, omega-3 fatty acids from wild salmon do not just provide structural benefits. They actively sensitize aging muscle to the anabolic signals it needs to build and maintain tissue. Eating wild salmon alongside protein therefore produces a better anabolic response than eating the same protein without the omega-3 context. The timing matters, the combination matters. And wild salmon delivers both the protein and the sensitizing fatty acid context in a single food. The third food is something that will genuinely surprise people who have been told that plant-based proteins are inferior for muscle building, and in its raw form, they are largely correct. But there is one plant-based food that breaks this rule significantly, and it is edamame, the whole immature soybean, consumed as a whole food rather than as processed soy derivatives. Edamame is the only plant food that is a complete protein, containing all essential amino acids in proportions that support muscle protein synthesis. But more than its protein profile, edamame contains a specific compound called beta-ecdysturone, a plant steroid that has been documented in recent clinical trials to enhance muscle protein synthesis through a pathway that involves binding to estrogen receptor beta in muscle tissue. A double-blind, placebo-controlled study published in 2019 found that participants receiving ecdysturone supplementation showed significantly greater increases in muscle mass and strength over 12 weeks compared to a control group, leading researchers to call for further investigation of what they described as a remarkable anabolic potency. Edamame as a whole food delivers ecdysturone alongside its complete protein content and a rich mineral profile including magnesium and zinc, both of which are cofactors in the testosterone synthesis pathway and the muscle protein synthesis machinery. For older adults seeking to maximize the plant-based component of their diet without sacrificing muscle support, edamame stands apart from every other legume and most plant foods in the research-supported depth of its muscle relevance. The fourth food is something that has been in the athletic and nutritional science conversation for years, but that older adults rarely hear presented in the context of their specific biology. Greek yogurt, specifically full-fat, unsweetened Greek yogurt with its exceptional casein protein content. Casein is a slow-digesting protein that releases amino acids into the bloodstream gradually over a period of 5 to 7 hours, creating what researchers call a prolonged amino acidemia, an extended elevation of blood amino acid levels that continues to support muscle protein synthesis long after the meal has been consumed. This slow-release profile is particularly valuable for older adults for two reasons. First, the muscle protein synthesis response in aging tissue is not just blunted in its peak response, but is also shorter in duration than in young muscle. A sustained amino acid supply extends the window during which synthesis is occurring. Second, the anti-catabolic effect of casein, meaning its ability to suppress muscle protein breakdown rather than just stimulate synthesis, is documented in research on older adults and is mechanistically important in the context of aging muscle, where breakdown has accelerated. Greek yogurt also delivers calcium in a highly bioavailable form, and the connection between calcium and vitamin D in the context of muscle function extends beyond bone health to direct effects on the neuromuscular junction, the interface between nerve and muscle that determines how efficiently a neural signal translates into muscle contraction. As this junction degrades with age, which it does, calcium-dependent function at the neuromuscular level becomes increasingly important to support. Greek yogurt consumed before bed is particularly strategic because the overnight fasting period is when muscle protein breakdown is most likely to exceed synthesis in older adults, and a slow-releasing casein protein source in the hours before sleep provides the sustained amino acid supply that counteracts this overnight catabolic drift. The fifth food completes the framework in a way that addresses a specific bottleneck that is almost never discussed in the mainstream conversation about muscle preservation and aging. It is beets, specifically whole beets and beet juice, and the mechanism has nothing to do with protein. It has to do with what happens inside the muscle cell during exercise, and why aging muscle recovers more slowly and responds less strongly to the exercise stimulus that is essential for muscle preservation. Beets are one of the richest dietary sources of inorganic nitrate, which the body converts to nitric oxide, and nitric oxide's role in muscle function goes beyond vasodilation. Inside muscle cells, nitric oxide directly improves mitochondrial efficiency, the efficiency of the cellular energy-producing structures that power every muscle contraction. Research from the Karolinska Institute demonstrated that dietary nitrate supplementation from beet juice reduced the oxygen cost of muscle contraction by a clinically significant margin in older adults, meaning the muscles produce the same work output while consuming less oxygen and experiencing less metabolic stress. In practical terms, this means that muscles supported by dietary nitrate from beets fatigue less quickly, recover more completely between exercise sessions, and generate a stronger adaptive signal to the exercise stimulus that drives muscle protein synthesis. Beets do not directly build muscle, but they create a metabolic environment inside the muscle cell in which the building process is more efficient, more responsive, and more sustainable over the weeks and months during which the real adaptation occurs. The framework these 5 foods create together is not a collection of independent superfoods. It is a system. Eggs provide the leucine trigger and the rapid, complete amino acid supply for acute synthesis. Wild salmon provides the omega-3 membrane sensitization that reduces anabolic resistance. Edamame provides sustained plant-based protein alongside beta-ecdysterone to enhance the synthetic pathway. Greek yogurt provides the slow-release casein for overnight anti-catabolism and neuromuscular support, and beets provide the nitrate to nitric oxide foundation that makes the muscle itself more efficient and more responsive to the training and nutritional signals that the other 4 foods are delivering. Consumed consistently, as regular features of the diet rather than occasional additions, this combination addresses the specific biological bottlenecks that make muscle preservation and rebuilding in aging legs so much harder than it was at 40, and so much more important. There is a decision point that most people cross somewhere in their late 50s or early 60s without realizing it, and the direction it tips them is determined not by genetics or by luck, but by whether they have the specific information to act differently. The decision point is whether leg muscle loss becomes something that is happening to them or something they are actively countering with the understanding of why it happens and what specifically addresses it. The people who maintain strong, functional legs into their 70s and 80s are not genetically exceptional. They are nutritionally intentional. They eat differently, not randomly or generally, but specifically, in service of the biology that determines whether muscle is preserved or lost. The legs are not just the body's transportation system. They are its metabolic engine, its glucose disposal mechanism, its lymphatic pump, its venous return pump, its largest reservoir of functional tissue. When they weaken, everything built on top of them becomes less stable, less efficient, less resilient. The energy drops. The blood sugar rises. The balance diminishes. The falls become more likely. The independence becomes more negotiated and less assumed. This cascade does not begin with a dramatic event. It begins with a slow process that has specific nutritional drivers and specific nutritional solutions, and you now know both sides of that equation. Tell me in the comments which of these 5 foods you are already eating and which ones surprised you with what they do at the cellular level. And if someone in your life is experiencing the early signs of leg weakness, or has been told that muscle loss is simply part of aging with nothing to be done about it, please share this video with them. Because the information gap between what most people are told and what the research actually supports is exactly the distance between a different outcome and the one they are currently headed toward. Your legs are not finished. The biology is not fixed. What you eat next is part of the story that has not been written yet. Write it differently, starting today.